Welcome everyone to my talk. I'd like to thank you for joining. My name is Peter Hunt. I am a senior software engineer at Red Hat. I typically work on Cryo and Kubernetes SIG node things, but I got my start at Red Hat working on Podman, and I've Podman desktop. So let's begin. Podman is now extending to the desktop on all of the operating systems near you. So let's begin with a problem statement. So local development environments have become both impractical and lack consistency with production. They're impractical in that there's a lot of complicated setup to get a development environment up and running, and your laptop naturally has more limited resources than your production servers have. And there's some third-party integration issues actually getting from local development to production. In addition, there's as mentioned with the limited resources, there's lack of consistency. The way that you run things in your local environment are unlikely to be the way that you run it live, especially if you're running in OpenShift or a distributed Kubernetes-like system. There's a lot more pieces at work in production environments than you can really realistically have on your laptop. And there's discrepancies with the way that containers and composite applications are getting configured to talk to each other. I mean, I feel like a lot of us here know how annoying it can be sometimes to be configuring networking between multiple servers. To solve this, a lot of developers end up using tools like Docker Compose, translating between local containers to then groups of containers. But this brings the worst of both worlds, where a developer needs to translate their application between local and then into production environments. So we can do better. And then on the other hand, in production, there are a lot of things that developers have to think about before they can deploy their app. Things like services and routes in OpenShift contexts. This is in addition to the cognitive overhead of translating their local application to production. At Red Hat, we like to make the developer experience simple and easy when developers are targeting Kubernetes as their runtime environment, especially OpenShift. As developers, testing our applications on Kubernetes and testing in an environment which is going to be as close as possible to the one used in production could be a challenge. Even if we have a commonality among containers, getting them to run on Kubernetes is a challenge. It's not as easy as build and refresh. The turnarounds are getting slower. As a developer, I only really care about developing and debugging my applications and then deploying them quickly and consistently across all of the footprints that I want them on. Luckily, Podman Desktop is aiming to fulfill all of these gaps. Podman Desktop shoots to simplify workflows and experiences with containers when targeting production on OpenShift and Kubernetes. It brings Kubernetes closer to the developer by leveraging Podman's pod functionality, and then minimizes the discrepancies between the desktop and target Kubernetes environments and tries to do the translation steps along the way. So let's talk about a little bit about how we do it. So everyone knows that Podman can use containers, and also probably everyone knows that they can use pods. It's in the name. If not, then Podman manages pods. A developer using Podman and Podman Desktop can start with their containers, and then they can group them. They can be translated into pods natively with Podman. And then those pods can be translated into Kubernetes pod YAMLs using the pod generate cube functionality. And then those cube YAMLs can be tested in a dev sandbox or a simulated Kubernetes environment. And then once that pod feels ready for production, that pod YAML can be adapted easily for production inside of OpenShift. And I'm going to show that in a demo. And I did my tithes to the demo gods were not enough today, so you're getting a video. It was going to be really cool live, and it's going to be really cool not live also. So imagine I'm a developer. I have my Python app and a Redis database to keep their information. I'm developing track the number of times a website has been loaded. So here we have in the Podman desktop UI a bunch of different tabs that'll allow us to inspect the state of the container and make sure that it's hunky-dory and we're ready to start grouping it with things. So we can play around with it. Right now, these two containers are separate, and the way that we connected them is with Podman's additional host flag. And so they are connected to each other, but that's not really how they're going to be connected in Kubernetes. The logical unit of containers in Kubernetes and most of the world now are pods. So we want them to be grouped together as a pod. Luckily, Podman Desktop allows us to build pods directly from containers that already exist, and it does this opaquely behind the scenes. So what we do here is we select our two containers that we want to podify, and then we click this fancy podify button, and it is now talking to the Podman server, which, by the way, is running on this machine in, well, this is being recorded on a Mac, but also I had intended on showing it on Windows, and it does work on Windows as well. You know, in the background as WSL, and then the Podman server is running in WSL, and the client is running in the, you know, in the Windows environment, the command prompt, and Podman Desktop talks through that. So here we've created our pod. That was easy. And it also, while it was creating that pod, it in the background stopped the other two containers for us so that there was no port contention. So here we can look at our pod, make sure everything looks good. We can see our containers. Two of them have exited because we stopped them. And then there are the two containers that have been podified and named as such inside of that pod. Now we can open up our application, our port 8080, and we can see that our Hello World application, we can track it with the Redis, and they're all connected. They're talking to each other. We're very happy as developers. And I think we're ready to ship in OpenShift. So we have connected Podman. Podman Desktop has a plugin for connecting to OpenShift and Kubernetes environments. And so as long as the Podman Desktop was launched when a kube context was set, then we can actually press this fancy deploy button there. Go ahead. I paused it. Nope, I didn't pause it. And by clicking the deploy button, we see in our OpenShift console here that we have, oh, we haven't clicked deploy yet. We're gonna though, right now. Click, oh. Yeah, and then so this deploy screen allows us to make a couple of decisions about the way that we're going to actually translate between the pod and the object that we're going to be creating in OpenShift. We're going to be using Kubernetes services and then OpenShift routes. So this allows us to translate natively between the pod just broadcasting on localhost to actually being broadcasted on the internet, and that's all really with the press of a button. So we're gonna, make sure we're inspecting that pod YAML to make sure it looks good, and we can highlight that our host port will end up being 8080, so the one that we actually ping on the real internet will be that. And we click deploy, and so now we can see, we can watch the state of the container creation process. And that would also be reflected inside of the OpenShift console. And we can click on this location, and we see here that we have our application on the internet running. We can also look at this pod. This pod has been deployed to OpenShift, so we can use all of the OpenShift console services that show us, make sure that our pod is looking up to snuff and is ready for, being deployed everywhere that our OpenShift is on. We can also check our logs in terminal just like we could with Podman Desktop, so the experience is very similar, so it'll reduce the cognitive overhead for that translation as well. And finally, we will be done with our demo. So in conclusion, context switch. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me. Here we have some links and locations where you can learn more. You can download Podman Desktop today, and you can connect it to your Kubernetes and OpenShift environments. Thank you.